Myth number 1. Napoleon was short. Being short is subjective. If you just want to classify anyone below the average male height as short, then Napoleon fits that criteria by today's standards, as the average male height today globally is around 5'7.5" or 170 centimeters. According to the French measurement system, Napoleon was 5'2", but the French inch pouce at the time was 2.7 centimeters, while the imperial inch was shorter at 2.54 centimeters. His height was measured and verified as just over 2 peds 2 pouces. That equals about 1.67 meters, or slightly under 5'6". So if you take into account the average height of the Frenchman at a time, which was around 5'4" or 163 centimeters, Napoleon might have even been slightly taller than the average man. This myth was spread by his enemies, mostly the British, and specifically cartoonist James Gillray, whose caricature depictions of Napoleon were so popular that Napoleon stated that Gillray did more than all the armies of Europe to bring me down. Myth number 2. Napoleon was Italian. This is a myth inside of a myth. You see, Napoleon wasn't born in France, but actually on the island of Corsica. Since Corsica was owned by the Italian city-state of Genoa for centuries, many Italians, like Napoleon's family, immigrated to the island. However, like many Corsicans, his parents, Carlo Maria di Bonaparte and Letizia Romanino, saw Corsica as its own entity, not Italian or French. In fact, France had purchased the island just 15 months before Napoleon was born, making him French, though his ancestors came from Italy. In fact, he was born as Napoleone di Bonaparte, but when he married Josephine, he made himself sound more French by dropping the second E in his first name and the U in his last name. So this myth isn't entirely wrong, but it's not entirely correct. Myth number 3. Napoleon was defeated solely by the Russian winter. The Russian winter is infamous for defeating any invading army, but it is given more credit for defeating Napoleon than it should have. You see, Napoleon invaded in June, the summer, and what's not well known about Russia is that the summer is also very brutal. The summer heat decimated many of his troops before Napoleon really even got started in his invasion. Another factor for his defeat was the sheer size of Russia. Napoleon had to march his army of about 650,000 about 15 to 20 miles, or about 24 to 32 kilometers a day, with a total march of around 2,000 miles or 3,200 kilometers. And since the Russians burned everything behind them as they retreated, Napoleon had to rely on his supply train to supply his troops. Obviously, his supply train being so long prevented quick movement, but more importantly, it was left very vulnerable to attack. And obviously without supplies, you can't properly invade a country. So there were actually many factors that contributed to Napoleon's defeat in Russia, not just the winter. Myth number 4. Napoleon continued/ended the ideals of the French Revolution. Many people believe that when Napoleon came to power, he destroyed the ideals of the French Revolution, while others believe he continued them. Like basically everything in history, the truth lies somewhere in the middle. You see, Napoleon would not have had any power if the French Revolution didn't happen, so he made sure one of the ideals he continued was the expansion of a merit-based system. His Napoleonic Code also expanded on other revolutionary principles. In fact, the very fact that all citizens across the country, regardless of class, would adhere to these laws expanded on the revolutionary ideals. The code increased property rights, freedom of religion, and general education. It also reformed the banks and currency and improved infrastructure. By and large, his code gave many more opportunities to those who were in lower classes, allowing them to advance in France, unlike many other European countries which were much more elitist, caring much more about who you were born to. Like I said, Napoleon, who came from a relatively humble background, did much to expand equality of opportunity. This was the biggest expansion of the ideals of the French Revolution. However, Napoleon also ended many other ideals. His very rulership got rid of the Republic in exchange for a centralized autocratic government. Many journalists and newspapers were shut down as political freedoms were heavily censored to promote order and stability. His extensive police state monitored political opposition and often imprisoned them, while men were given much more control over their wives, and equality for women was scaled back. Myth number 5. Napoleon came from a powerful family. While Napoleon's family were nobles from Corsica, they were relatively poor and not very respected by the native French nobles. In fact, this led to Napoleon often suffering from discrimination from his fellow students, as he was the only Corsican, had poor French, and spoke with an accent. Myth number 6. Napoleon wanted to conquer the world. While Napoleon did have expansive ambitions, his main objective was simply to secure a European empire. He wanted to expand French influence over territories that had historically threatened or aligned with France. And since the powerful European monarchs threatened Napoleon's plans to keep France secure with revolutionary ideals, he had limited options but to go to war with them. Myth number 7. Napoleon always had a rivalry with Russia. Although Napoleon famously invaded Russia with about 500,000 men, he and Tsar Alexander were fairly friendly for a while. Their good relationship began when they met at the Treaty of Tilsit, where the Tsar agreed to abide by Napoleon's continental blockade of the British. From then on, they were pretty good friends. In fact, Napoleon described Alexander as especially handsome, like a hero with all the graces of an amiable Parisian. And he even wrote to his wife that, if Alexander were a woman, I would make him my mistress. Eventually, however, their differences would eventually lead to war again. Myth number 8. Napoleon converted to Islam. Napoleon was actually baptized Catholic as a child, but he was not particularly devoted to his faith as he became an adult. During his Egyptian campaign, however, he respected and often partook in many Muslim celebrations, worships, and practices, though he mostly did it in the hopes that he would be seen more favorably as the ruler of a non-French population. Napoleon probably admired some aspects of Islam, but his main purpose in partaking in Muslim activities was to form a better relationship with the people he was ruling. And although he slightly thought about formally converting to Islam, he ultimately did not. Myth number 9. He shot the nose off the Sphinx. While Napoleon spent several years in Egypt, he did not order his troops to use the Sphinx for target practice with cannons. We know this because the Sphinx nose was actually verified to have been gone almost a half a century before Napoleon and his troops even arrived in Egypt. Since Danish naval captain Frederick Norden had made sketches that clearly depicted the Sphinx without a nose in 1737. Myth number 10. Napoleon won all his battles except Waterloo. While Waterloo is his most famous and last defeat, it was far from his only one. Some of his major defeats include the Battle of Aspern-Essling in 1809, when Napoleon attempted to cross the Danube River to engage the Austrian army under Archduke Charles. When his forces split, Austrian troops with their superior position and artillery launched a counterattack that inflicted mass casualties on the French, which destroyed their key pontoon bridges, which trapped many soldiers. Napoleon was forced to retreat, suffering over 20,000 casualties. The Battle of Leipzig is probably his second most famous defeat, taking place in 1813. When Napoleon with 200,000 troops was heavily outnumbered by the massive 350-strong army of Russia, Prussia, Austria, and Sweden. After multiple days, Napoleon was forced to retreat across the Elster River with 80,000 casualties. The Battle of La Rothiere, fought in 1814, was fought against Russian and Prussian forces under Prince von Blücher, which resulted in Napoleon's retreat as his exhausted troops struggled against the numerically superior and better supplied coalition forces. Myth number 11. Napoleon was exiled once. After his defeat in the War of the Sixth Coalition, Napoleon was forced to abdicate in early 1814. Rather than executing him, the victorious allies allowed Napoleon to keep his title of emperor and exiled him to the small Mediterranean island of Elba. However, this exile was short-lived, as Napoleon escaped less than a year later, returning to France and reclaiming power. The European powers declared war on him personally and mobilized around 100,000 men each to defeat him. Napoleon's defeat at the Battle of Waterloo in June 1815 solidified his downfall, and this time the Allied powers were determined to keep him away, so they exiled him to the remote island of St. Helena, located in the South Atlantic Ocean, far from Europe. Unlike Elba, where he had some degree of freedom, Napoleon was kept under strict British supervision, where escape was nearly impossible. He spent the final 6 years of his life there, dying in 1821. Myth number 12. Napoleon was uncaring toward his soldiers. Since Napoleon came from a poor noble family, he understood the hardships the average soldier faced more than most commanders. Napoleon would frequently do difficult and dangerous jobs himself, always working side by side with those he led. He inspected and gave out awards personally, and early on he slept in the same conditions and marched alongside his troops. Though as time went on, health issues and burnout would eventually cause Napoleon to become less and less of the leader he once was. Myth number 13. Napoleon's armies were entirely French. In many earlier battles, Napoleon was in command of mostly or entirely French troops. However, as he became emperor and conquered more and more of Europe, the troops under his command diversified. During his Russian campaign, he commanded a 600,000 strong army. However, less than half of it was French. He used many foreign soldiers from allied nations and nations he had conquered. Men from Italy, Poland, the German state, Spain, the Netherlands, and Switzerland would fight for him. Myth number 14. Napoleon was poisoned. Just after his death on May 5th, 1821, local doctors conducted an autopsy, concluding that he had died due to stomach cancer. However, since he had been suffering from chronic stomach pain, nausea, and hair loss, some believe those symptoms were from arsenic poisoning. This theory gained traction in the 20th century when scientific tests found high levels of arsenic in Napoleon's hair, leading some to suspect that he had been slowly poisoned over time by his British captors or even by someone within his own household. However, since arsenic was commonly found in many household items, including wallpaper, cosmetics, and medicine, exposure to it was far from unusual. Additionally, Napoleon's family had a history of stomach cancer, as his father had also died of the same disease. Myth number 15. Napoleon used a body double to escape from St. Helena. According to this legend, instead of dying in exile in 1821, Napoleon managed to switch places with a loyal follower or body double, allowing him to flee the island undetected and live out the rest of his life under a different name somewhere in Europe or the Americas. The man to allegedly take his place was Francois Eugene Robiaud, a poor Frenchman who is said to have disappeared sometime in 1818 after reportedly being visited by one of Napoleon's generals, Gaspard Gourgaud. However, not only is there no evidence that Francois Eugene ever existed, Napoleon's body was also taken back to Paris and was confirmed to be in fact Napoleon's in 1840. Number 16. Napoleon was anti-religion. Like I said earlier, Napoleon was originally baptized as Catholic, but he became less devoted as he became an adult. And like I said in Myth 8, he did not convert to Islam. He saw religion as a political necessity, often treating religion as a tool for state control and unity. He believed that religion could be useful in maintaining order, strengthening his rule, and ensuring loyalty among his subjects, which is why he restored Catholicism in 1804, though he limited their power by keeping it strictly under state authority. He also granted a major amount of religious freedoms to Protestants and Jews. Myth number 17. Napoleon's last words were Josephine. At the age of 51, Napoleon died on St. Helena on May 5th, 1821. However, the eyewitness accounts of his final hours have many differences regarding his last words. It is likely he said something about the army or head of army, and according to two witnesses, Napoleon also said France and my son. Only one witness, Charles de Montholon, reported that Napoleon said Josephine, but since he wrote his memoirs about 20 years after Napoleon's death while he was imprisoned with Napoleon III, Montholon probably wrote it just to honor his friend and rally the French to Louis Napoleon's cause. So Josephine was most likely not one of Napoleon's last words.